The light utility pickups would become the little brother of the custom van scene. But a new generation of mini truckers would develop their own style, drawing inspiration from lowriders, Euro sport compact cars, Volkswagen Bugs, and hot rods of the era. Dancing tilt beds would lead the way for body drops and airbags. Cruising as low as you could was always the goal. So for this episode and the next few episodes of Influence and Impact, we're going to be looking at the history of the mini truck. And mini trucks have kind of been, depending on who you talk to and what era, a bad word or a, derogatory term. A lot of the older hot rod guys maybe think lesser of the mini trucks. But to be honest, if we didn't have mini trucks, there's a huge segment and a lot of people of this industry that wouldn't be around. They would not exist because that's where a lot of people got their foundation. I know it's kind of where you and I got our start in the industry.
Absolutely.
And, even most of the hot rod shops from, back in the day to even now, chances are either those guys got their start in mini trucks or the guys in the back were mini truck guys.
Absolutely. I mean, the sad thing about people picking on mini trucks is that mini trucks is really kind of the introductory vehicle that gets you into, and I don't want to call it hot rodding because hot rodding refers to something that's more kind of,
you're going for the speed. You're going for, there a lot of those hot rod guys were, everything was kind of built off of racing,
right?
Drag racing, going out to the dry lakes, and mini trucks were kind of more style.
Exactly. Well, they were. First and foremost, they were just a good form of transportation.
Yeah.
You got to figure that your average mini truck guy, even when mini trucks came out in the late 60s, early 70s, these were younger guys that maybe had a job pumping gas, right? And they couldn't afford a muscle car or, what they were really kind of after too was a lot of vans were going on. Like there was a big van craze going on.
You're talking the 70s and you had probably some Pro Street, maybe some street rods were the higher end, rich guys basically.
Yeah.
And for a young 18-year-old kid, or not even that, a 16-year-old kid in high school, well, a mini truck was a couple $1,000. It was easy on gas, especially because we're talking about the oil, crisis and gas crunch in the mid 70s. But yeah, they kind of attached themselves as kind of the younger brother of the van craze.
That's right.
And a lot of the similarities of the style and, the shows, the runs were connected to the van scene.
Well, and I think another thing that really was kind of maybe a black eye for the mini truckers was most of them were not U.S. made.
Yeah.
I mean, at the time when they were introduced, in the 60s, really Datsun, and I say Datsun, not even Nissan.
Yeah, it was Datsun at the time.
At the time.
Yeah, or at least in the U.S.
And also Toyota were really the only guys that were importing in vehicles. So for, the first 10 years of mini trucks being here in the United States, you had two options. You had a Datsun or a Toyota. And Datsuns were better looking. So, of course, more people used, they were into Datsuns.
And that's, the early Toyota Stout and stuff kind of had a different look that was very different from the 70s and 60s trucks or cars or anything.
They looked Japanese.
They looked, and they looked older.
Yeah.
They just had, I mean, now like people love them and they're cool, but
sure.
Obviously back then there's, the Datsuns and stuff were a little bit more stylized and sleek and stuff like that. But obviously Ford, Chevy.
Well, they didn't have it. No, they didn't have an option.
They didn't have an option,
Yeah.
But they started building smaller compact cars, obviously the trucks and stuff. But yeah, they kind of borrowed a little bit from the Japanese imports for the first few years.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't ignore, and again, this is the 70s where large vehicles, everybody from the 60s and 50s had these large vehicles, and Americans wanted the huge long roofs or long hoods.
You're talking about your Cadillacs, and your Lincolns with boats basically.
Yeah,
on
exactly.
Wheels, yeah.
So the same thing happened with the trucks as well. I mean, we had full-size trucks, which, we call them full-size trucks now, but back then they were just trucks. You didn't refer to them as, that's a full-size.
Well, because there wasn't a mini truck.
There wasn't a mini truck. So the Japanese versions, obviously being smaller, they called them mini trucks. I mean, that's not a big deal. But 72 is usually right around the time that we start to see the influence of the partners of the American companies, the Isuzus, the Mitsubishis, the
Mazdas and stuff.
Mazdas.
You had the Ford Courier, that was introduced in 1971.
Which was just a B-series Mazda.
Yeah, that was a Mazda. You look at a picture of an old Courier and an old, kind of Mazda at that time, and they were basically the same. And that continued through a lot of the years of kind of mixing and matching. And people would do that. They would, have an S10 and throw an Isuzu front end on it, or they would, kind of mix things up. But obviously Chevy Love, that was probably the most, van inspired, truck at the time.
And I like how you call that. Yeah, I like how you say van inspired, because first off, okay, do you know what Love stands for?
No, but I'm guessing it's not hippie related.
No, it stands for light utility vehicle. And that's exactly what it was. It was the smaller version of what Chevy offered. It was manufactured by Isuzu, which actually their version is called the Faster. So an Isuzu Faster is a Chevy Love.
Yeah.
Okay. Which later on became a Isuzu Pup.
Yeah.
Which now, do you know what PUP stands for?
I'm going to say pickup utility pickup or
no,
something.
No, you're very close.
But something like that.
It was actually they just shortened the word pickup.
Okay.
So it was a
pup.
It was a pup.
No, and so you're talking about pups and stuff, but there was also a little bit of pup was used as a different term.
Yeah.
In the early years with the van guys and the mini truck guys.
Right. Where the van guys would pick on the mini truckers, and they'd call them puppy truckers.
Yeah.
Because they weren't, big enough yet to be cool with the van guys, right?
Yeah. And they were the younger crowd.
Yeah.
They were, to me, you think of, 70s, van, you think of the shag, carpet, the
Which
bed,
they were.
the TV, the little mini bar or something. And, some, hippie or old biker dude trying to, get some chick into the, in the back and stuff. And so obviously these were the younger, high school and early kids and stuff. But a lot of the early mini truck style, even if it was, wasn't necessarily import style as we'd think of,
right?
It was van. You had camper shells.
Yes.
You had the same graphics or murals along the side, of the truck that you'd see on a van. I mean, basically it did just look like a miniature version of a van,
right?
Because even a lot of them, it had a pickup bed, but you'd put a shell on it with a walkthrough or something. And basically, you just got a small van.
Well, let's think of this too. Mini truck guys, kind of like you said, they followed the genre of the van guys, and the van guys, they would like to do events. Like they were into going to places and camping, because obviously you could put a bed in a van, right?
Yeah, so you're parking, you're drinking, and then you just fall asleep in your van, and
you could party and have a place to pass out and get up again and party. So the van runs, as they call them, that became very popular, where you would actually go to an event and spend 3 or 4 days at a campsite or an area, and it would kind of have like your mini Woodstock, if you would, right?
Yeah. No, it was a festival. It was similar to like the bike rallies or bike runs. It was basically just get everyone together in more likely a remote area where you can just do whatever you want, have fun, party, and show off. But and that's like we talk obviously magazines and stuff like that. Trucking Magazine was kind of the first to really capture that, and they started with vans, but it was interesting, for the first several years on the cover of the magazine, it would be a van, a full-size, Chevy or Ford, maybe a classic, 50s, truck or something like that, and a mini.
Yeah.
Like that was basically, here's the truck scene, and it's vans, classic, or what we would call classics, and, a mini truck.
And that was the scene at the time.
Yeah.
If you went to one of those van runs, that's what you would see there. It would be parked there. It'd be an F100, maybe even a carry-all style, like Suburban, tons of vans, and then mini trucks.
Yeah.
And most of those guys at the time, the mini truck runs or the van runs, it was very similar. I like to call them like a big family picnic. Like they would have events, like they would do a sporting event, maybe a softball game or a tug of war or something like that. But then they'd also have like, obviously drinking contests, your mug holding, chug your beer. No, but, and again, too, people would bring food. You would have a cookout. I mean, it resembled,
you were camping. It was a party.
It resembled like a big music festival.
And I think too, there's the van runs had evolved then into the truck runs and the river runs and a lot of the stuff. And then obviously there's shows. So I think, it's kind of, like there's a lot of history there that we can dedicate, as its own kind of,
and I think that should be its own episode.
Yeah. But back to, kind of the styling, a lot of the early, trends were, like I said, very coming from the van world, where you'd have, your flares, you'd have, slotted mag wheels,
side pipes.
You do the side pipes.
Yeah.
You would do, the
mural.
glory grill up in the front,
Right.
like it looked a lot like a van, and some of that started to kind of, shift and change a little bit, as the years went on, when you started getting kind of the next generation of not only, truck guys, but the actual imported, mini trucks and stuff like that.
Well, yeah, and again, too, it took a little bit of time for Americans to realize, because again, too, in '72, Ford brought a Courier. Well, Couriers outsold Mazda B series trucks, or even like the '74 Mazda rotary truck that most people don't even know existed. But
that's because of a Ford, so it was,
right. So they sold a Ford Courier. They sold a Chevy Love. They didn't sell an Isuzu Faster, or they didn't sell a B series Mazda pickup. So it took a little bit of time for people to get back into that.
Yeah,
and also too, but there was two manufacturers that paved that way, and they knew that they got to America first, and they knew that they had to continue paving the way, and that was Toyota and Datsun coming into now being called Nissan. And that even too was a big deal, because Datsun was the pet name of the Nissan Corporation. So that's the reason why it was called Datsun. It's just kind of like what they were called, because back then they made a car in the early 30s that was called Dat car.
Okay.
And so it was like kind of Nissan's, jokingly they would call them Dat cars. So Datsun, I don't know how that really kind of came about, but that's how it came about.
No,
so
I'm sure
finally,
there's a reasoning behind all of this.
But then finally, in the late '70s, it was being known that, hey, we're the Nissan Corporation making Datsun cars. We should be known as the Nissan Corporation. So there was a transitional state that begun in about 1980, where they were trying to transition over to the Nissan name. So, by '84, Nissan was the name of the trucks, and that's when things really, for them, it really kind of sped a lot of things up.
Yeah, the late '70s, it all started to pop up, because we're talking, Truck and Magazine started to pop up. You also had, Hot Rod was even starting to kind of show a little bit of the truck side, of things, and they had like California style trucks and all that. So it was, they were kind of keeping up with the trend of, hey, the old guys have the 32 Ford. Well, hey, this is what the young guys are doing, and kind of hot rodding. They're not necessarily doing the same things, but a lot of them are also kind of crossing over a little bit. You start seeing, some more kind of customizing that's maybe drawing a little bit from the street rod style and from kind of the boat, graphics and stuff as well.
Well, the thing about the '70s was about cruising. Okay. I mean, you got to remember, like Van Nuys Boulevard, like that's at the height of like the cruising movement.
Yeah.
Right. Lowriders as well. If you look at those guys, East LA, driving around in their early cars, basically transportation and freedom of transportation was the big deal of the '70s. And so that's where you were going to have the guys that, Friday night was to go out and go cruise someplace, or a Saturday night was, we're going to go to this location, hang out, meet up, and do our thing. That transferred obviously into the '80s and into the '90s as well. But the '70s seemed to be the time that it really like made a difference. And even to the point where law enforcement started to crack down on cars.
Yeah.
There was, headlight violations, you being too low or being dangerous, that kind of things. That would really hit hard in the 70s.
And even too, you're talking about, you brought up the lowrider, scene, and kind of later that would start to kind of blend in to the, mini trucks, and there's kind of that whole style that emerged. But for the guys in the 70s that were lowrider, like there was still several, clubs that were street gangs, or that turned into street gangs, or kind of were mixed in. So there was a heavy kind of stigma with, lowriding in the 70s and early 80s, that it kind of started to die out. Even Lowrider Magazine went away,
right?
For several years. And so that kind of crowd, the younger, their younger brother started kind of picking up a mini truck,
right?
Or a Volkswagen.
Yeah.
I mean, Dukes is like, there's a, Lowrider Club Dukes. That's one of the earliest, clubs in the lowriding scene, and kind of, royalty for lowriders. And I remember, I can't remember the guy's name, but the son of one of the founders of it, he started picking up a Volkswagen.
Right.
You know, and he would do some of the similar things of putting the chrome, you know, having the chrome on it and lowering it and all that. That was kind of influenced by the you know, lowrider bombs.
Right.
You know, but it was on a Volkswagen, and well, start doing that. Well, okay, well now I got a truck. Let me maybe do some of the same things on a truck.
Right.
So,
well, and I think that's, you know, kind of generational, because the van guys were a little bit older. And even some of the early mini truck guys, you know, by the time that you're talking, when, you know, Volkswagens and mini trucks started to kind of become the rage for someone that was in their early 20s and let's say the early 80s, they wanted to be totally different than the 70s guys.
Yeah.
You know, the 70s guys were still tied heavily into the vans. By the early 80s, vans were not a thing. Vans were on the decline.
Well, and that's, you know, we talking about, you know, back to the magazine thing, just because that's always usually a little bit of a gauge of obviously what's going on at that time period. But we always joke that it's maybe a year behind that time period, actually.
Yeah.
Because you got to figure by the time someone completed a build, it was photographed, it came out in the magazine, you're probably at minimum 3 months.
Oh, yeah.
At least probably a year.
Right.
You know, from when actually someone starts thinking about it.
Sure.
So...
And then also,
but for the rest of the country, you know, that maybe weren't flying out to a show or something like that, that was brand new, and that was the only way that they could see what was going on was through a magazine. But with magazines, like, you had multiple different ones for about mini trucks and vans and stuff like that, and several of them that were started in the 70s. By 84, they were out of business. You know, by 84, trucking no longer had any vans on the cover, you know, of the magazine. I don't, you know if they had anything, you know, feature wise, but like basically it was like, okay, vans are done, they're outdated, those are the old guys stuff.
Right.
You know, there was obviously a couple people that kind of held on to it, but that was old school.
It wasn't the masses.
Now let's get into the new school stuff.
Well, and I think also that changed too with, again, the age of people that were currently buying mini trucks.
Yeah.
And also too, the mini trucks changed. You know, like 1980 was the first year. Well, let's even take this back. In 76, Datsun releases the 720 King Cab, right? And that's the first mini truck that's an extra cab that had extra space. It wasn't just a standard cab with a bench seat. Right? It had enough. If you were over the height of 6'2", you could sit in a mini truck basically, right? That was a big deal. That hit sales with Ford and Chevy big time in the late 70s. So by 1980, when they introduced the 720 Nissan, a King Cab was a big deal. Well, I say 720 Datsun because it is still 1980.
Yeah.
But you know, that body style truck lasted from 1980 to 1986 because obviously the Nissan Hardbody came out in 1986 and a half, which is a big deal. But you know, you're looking at those trucks; those exploded. Those were and they also had a version called their ST, which was the sport truck version. It had, you know, upgraded wheels. It had power windows. It had, you know, cruise control. Some were automatics. I mean, this was like high-dollar luxury stuff in a small little mini truck.
Yeah, and that's what I was going to say is that the mini trucks were very affordable because, they were all just a little manual, a little maybe four banger.
Oh, you were stoked if you got a 5-speed.
Yeah.
Like that was like an option.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, no frills, no nothing. It was
Yeah.
just a small little pickup, so it was cheap. But then, hey, you can mess with it.
But you got a
can
brand
upgrade
new
it.
car for cheap.
Yeah.
You know, that, like I said, the guy that's working at the gas station or the donut shop or, you know, the record store, this guy, he got a brand new car rather than a used car that might break down.
Yeah, your uncle's or your grandpa's car or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, that was Datsun's big thing, obviously turning into Nissan through that body style truck. But also, too, 84, the Toyota Hilux comes out. That's redesigned. And it looked better than the earlier version truck. I mean, it looked modern. It looked the time. And I mean, kind of like, I know, like to put you into that time frame, 84, 85, I mean, think of like Max Headroom, like how everything all of a sudden looks very more computer, more futuristic.
It's, 84, you know, Apple, that was their huge, you know, deal, the personal computer. So that style of the 80s, what we consider the quintessential kind of 80s, was starting to come into its own.
Right.
And so, all the van stuff looked old.
It looked old,
you know,
right.
and so now we're getting more sleek. And, you know, Chevy, obviously they went away from their love and they introduced the S10.
Well, they started building their own.
Yeah.
Right.
And it was their own build and their own, you know, kind of deal. And that was in, you know, 82.
late 81
Yeah.
is when like S10s came out. But 82 is kind of like really when you saw them at the masses. But and they launched. But see, Chevy was smart. They launched a whole line. They didn't just say, "Hey, we're going to build a truck." They built a truck, an extended cab, even an SUV version. You know, they made the mini
like
Blazer.
The 400 and stuff. Toyota didn't come out.
They didn't come out with that yet, right? You know,
and that's you started to see a shift in the younger guys that were into those, that the style was getting away from the vans.
Yeah.
Bringing in some of maybe the Porsche alloys, to kind of the Volkswagen style. And, and there's also, and we'll bring these guys up later because they kind of were at one of the forefronts of the resurgence of the old school mini trucks. But there was a club called New Minis.
True.
Which, was called New Minis because they weren't.
They weren't
the
old
guys
school,
from the van, era.
Right.
They were new. They wanted to separate themselves and the style of it.
I think the easiest way to explain that was at the time the younger generation didn't want to look like the older mini trucks with the weird looking camper shell, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Everything at the time, even like in the world, you had DeLoreans, you had Mercedes, you had all of this. BMWs all of a sudden became like an influence to people with money in America. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, a Cadillac wasn't the car that you reached for. You went to get to
grandpa's
Mercedes.
car,
right?
Your dad's car. Yeah.
So the guys with the mini trucks, they were the first generation to say, "I want something that's more Euro." Mm-hmm. They had to buy Japanese to be Euro. And what I mean by that is they would buy like a mini truck, but the first thing they would do is like paint everything the same color.
Yeah.
Right. So monochromatic paint job. Well, that came from Mercedes. Okay. The next thing they would do is, the side of the wheels should be very sleek and not like a big dish deal. Like you have like a lot of hubcaps even at first were
and
a
that's
big deal.
What the style of the 80s, the new cars and stuff,
right?
A Corvette or something was a very
like a wheel
flat,
cover.
Yeah, it was a flat wheel or it was a hubcap or something like that, and that was just part of the design. So it was bringing in and mixing and matching and the same things. And
I mean, even think of like, you mentioned the Porsche alloy, which actually comes from kind of like the marriage between the Volkswagen crowd and the mini truck crowd, which was kind of funny how the Volkswagen crowd kind of married into those guys, almost like how the van guys allowed the mini truck guys to come in. So those guys kind of teamed up too, and they had their own shows, and we'll talk more about that later. But that's why Porsche alloys came out, because they were a German wheel. Renaults came out because they were a German wheel, and it just all of a sudden
Inkeys,
BBS, the web, your classic honeycomb or web series wheel, that became really popular because it looked European.
Yeah.
Right. Recaro seats, that kind of stuff was really a big deal. But here's another thing that was a really big deal at that time too: music.
Yeah.
Where you had for the first time, not only you had horsepower in music, you can actually have a stereo that could actually perform well, but also too the pull-out stereos.
Yeah.
That's,
you're talking 80 mid 80s kind of is where we're at right now. And that was the first time, and it wasn't popular because you couldn't maybe afford or buy CDs, but the first, in-car CD player from Pioneer came out in 1984.
Right.
So they were, the car audio industry wouldn't really have happened if it wasn't for mini trucks, because that was kind of the first culture to embrace and want big old 15-inch subwoofers, filling the entire bed. I mean, you're not going to put a stereo in a 32 Ford.
Right.
You got a Bel Air or something like, you're not doing a big speaker.
No.
And especially too, if the mini truck crowd was about cruising and showing off, well, you could hear you down the block if you're cranking the stereo up. So,
but it was also the generation too, because the mini trucker in the 70s, they still wanted to go and see like a local band.
Well, it was still, your hair band, or not even your hair bands, but your long hair bands,
yeah, exactly.
Your rock bands, your Zeppelins, your Skinner, your
again, like all of their events were mini Woodstocks. I go back to that where it just seems like, hey, there was a band there, a bunch of people camped out, they did their thing. Truck shows, and I say now this is another thing that kind of changed things, because they called them truck runs. By the 80s, we're calling them truck shows, because the element also of showing your truck off. Yeah. That
competing for points.
Competing for that also came out of the 70s by people going to an RG Canning show. Mm-hmm. And RG Canning was a promoter at the time that he would promote humongous shows. I mean, they were put on at, inside arenas. They weren't like an outside deal. They were promoted on the radio,
wasn't your
TV.
local little high school show.
It was a big
cruise
deal,
night.
right?
Yeah.
And they had to, of course, this was still left over from the '50s customs thing. So they already had like a way of showing cars. They knew how to like judge a car, and there was a system of points that was put up there. And
the displays, because even you look at some of the '60s custom shows, and they always had some displays and stuff like that,
which you would get points for.
Yeah, exactly. And I was kind of bringing it all into that,
right?
But and with the music thing, a lot of that from the younger generation with hip hop and rap kind of coming about, like you'd have DJs that would show up to a party,
right?
Well, and chances are they had a mini truck because you had to throw all the speakers and all that stuff in the back of the bed. He was either a van or a mini truck, but a younger guy's going to have a mini truck,
right?
All right, throw all the stuff in the back and show up.
Well, in the '80s too, house parties became big.
Yeah.
Right. And so at a house party, you'd have a DJ. You normally wouldn't really have a band unless someone had a good band around. But most of the time you had a DJ and you had some type of entertainment that had to do around music. Girls would dance, guys would hang out, do their thing. Right. So a lot of that culture too came from the house party to go into the streets.
Yeah. Well, and there was even, obviously truck clubs, started popping up. And it was always kind of funny, some of the names of them, of like, the SoCal's finest and desirable ones.
Oh,
and, it was always something, local finesse. I was in that truck club and they started in the late '80s, and it's like, there's always like something cool and sleek and stuff like that. But there was a lot of what were called party crews back then, and where they didn't have a mini truck maybe, but they were basically like, a club of guys and girls that would organize not only to go to other parties, but throw parties of themselves, on their own, and just kind of all promote it. So that was kind of its own little scene. And of course the mini truck guys, blended into that and the music, and it all kind of was part of that same culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
So.
Well, one of the other big things that was, kind of came out of the '70s and obviously from the van craze was the custom paint jobs.
Yeah.
If it was very hard to not see a van that had some type of artwork put on the side of it, either a name or a logo or
a mural
or something, Aztec warrior or some type of wizard, whatever.
Right? Yeah. You had a 6-foot canvas that was flat,
right?
So, let your sign painter or your painter and stuff, go at it. And it was very similar to, what was on the mini trucks.
Some of them had like linear graphics, but most of them were like more of a mural. But what was funny was with the mini trucks, if you didn't have a shell, you didn't have a lot of room to put a mural. Yeah. So that's why linear graphics became more of like the graphic of the time. So in the '70s, you had like your Carter Reeds, he was kind of the real well-known guy, but some of the older guys, even like your Gene Winfields, they were still doing mini trucks. Larry Watson was doing mini trucks, where you would think of those guys as custom painters.
But they were,
they were just sticking with the times. It was a business, right?
You got to do what you do. And, and then those guys influence obviously kind of people that we look at as very pioneers in the mini truck and other worlds, like Pete Santini.
Oh yeah, who's an understudy of Carter Reed.
Yeah, and he obviously younger guy. Yeah, so if he's just starting to get painting in the '70s and stuff like that,
right? By the '80s, that's your stride.
Yeah, and that's your hot rod guy is going to go to Carter Reed, right? But your high school kid with a Volkswagen or a mini truck's
probably going to go
to see Pete because he's more of your generation and your style.
And Pete, who was located in Orange County. He was kind of at the epicenter of what was going on, because at the same time, too, when that's going on and when the 80s are kind of just warming up, the surf industry is also just warming up.
Yeah.
So a lot of the surf fashion actually spilled over.
And BMX.
And action sports is all getting started at that time. And it's getting popular. It's almost like mini trucking kind of reminds me of skateboarding, where it had like a very big spike when it first got started and then kind of went dormant and then got huge. Yeah. And that's kind of the same method that happened with mini trucks, where, the 80s was the explosion. And this is when you're going to get music, fashion, and younger people all together at one time. So it's going to get to be a big deal.
Well, and that's, it kind of blended it. And that's, if you're going surfing, either a van, a station wagon, or you're going to have a truck. It's easy to put a surfboard in the back of a pickup truck and cruise down to the beach.
And you got to remember too, for parents buying kids cars, it's very simple to buy a mini truck, because mini trucks back then were $5,000.
Yeah.
right? You know, so that's another reason why instead of buying that old, you know, beat up LTD Ford from the 70s that sucks down gas, you got a 4-cylinder brand new truck. Yes, it's a stick shift, but so what?
Yeah. And I think too, you know, there might be maybe some concern with the parents that, like, yeah, if you got a, you know, 4-door car that can fit, you know, 6 people,
right,
you might get into more trouble than, you know, one that could just maybe fit your girlfriend or something.
But you got to remember back then, though. Back then, we were allowed to ride in the back.
That's true.
And that was something that is a big deal about. You'd pile all your buddies in the back and go cruise.
Yep.
Again, that cruise thing comes back that you couldn't get away from that because, let's face it, mini trucks weren't fast.
Well, no, and that's so low and slow. That's the tempo.
Right,
you know?
right.
That's Beastie Boys said it.
Yeah.
And that was true definitely for that. And that, you know, probably came a lot from the lowrider world where they were going after style and check me out versus I want to go fast.
Yeah.
You know, but, and that's what, you know, some of the older van era mini trucks were borrowing a lot from the hot rods and street rods where you see louvered hoods.
Right.
You know, you would see a chopped, you know, top on a bullet side or something like that. But, you know, a lot of the 80s kind of style, they were borrowing from the surf world. They were borrowing from MTV.
Yes.
You know, all the talk about the graphics, the splatter paint, the neon, you know, all that kind of stuff was
here's another trend that kind of comes up in the 80s that's going to make a lot of people laugh right now. Truckarosas, chop top, radical tops, removable target tops.
Yeah.
You know, even mini blazers that had the roof was removable in the early ones, the S15s.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that was a big craze too to kind of reconfigure what a truck looked like.
Yeah.
Right. It wasn't just here's a cab, here's a camper shelf, you want to add it or not. I mean, this was like, no, I'm going to cut the roof. I mean, I cut the roof off my buddy's S10. You know, I mean, that's how that was one thing. Let's cut the roof off and make it a convertible.
Yeah.
Right.
No, and the same thing is you know, the fabrication started getting more heavy, but it was still a very entry level vehicle because you know, I remember even, you know, like Ernie Macias, who was much, you know, later on in the mini truck world, but was very keen to the history of it.
Yeah.
You know, he said, like, yeah, we could buy a truck at the dealership on Thursday.
Yeah.
Put lowering blocks, paint the brake drums.
Yeah.
You know, and maybe throw a set of wheels on from something else.
Right.
Crank the torsion bars, you know, down.
Yeah.
And take it to a show on Saturday and win a trophy.
Yeah.
You know, because it was still a simple entry to kind of be cool with a mini truck back then.
Right.
And that's, you know, you start getting some more trends that we, you know, see and we associate definitely with that era of, you know, okay, no, there's no more shag carpeting. You were now doing a tweed interior.
Yes.
You know, for custom stuff. You had, you know, air shocks kind of coming into play where, you know, you could still adjust it so you're getting as low as you could, but you could still kind of get in and out of driveways and stuff like that with, you know, just maybe, when you're going to go for a cruise night or a show, crank the torsion bars down, you know, let the air out of the air shocks in the back and you were good. And then, hey, you got to still get to school, you know, the next week and, you know,
well, because
put it back to normal.
Yeah. And like you mentioned too, the van craze, there was a lot of parts that went on mini trucks in the early days that were van inspired, but there's also a few things like, I mean, Mike Burley comes to mind. Where Mike Burley, Sir Michael's, he was kind of really the first guy that started making styling parts out of metal that made a lot more sense than just a regular fiberglass bolt-on that was from a van. Like Mike was making stuff that was for mini trucks by a mini trucker. Yeah. Okay. He wasn't trying to adapt a van part to put onto a mini truck.
Well, and that's a lot of the early mini truckers. Yeah, we're just adapting things from like Johnny Speed and Chrome for Volkswagen parts. Well, okay, let me put this mirror on. Maybe it's, or this wheel.
Yeah.
It's meant for a Volkswagen, but hey, let me throw it on a mini truck. But then obviously as popularity grows and guys get a little older, you're starting to make, you know, see companies pop up and that were making parts specifically for a mini truck.
Right.
And that's, you know, we kind of started to see a little bit differing of the styles starting to evolve. You know, where you had the quintessential kind of 80s, you know, or white boy style.
The Zach Morris driver.
Zach Morris,
totally.
That thing, the Orange
slick
County
hair, the Oakley blades, the fluorescent, you know, clothing on, the checkered vans, all of that stuff all came in at that time.
Yeah. And that's, and obviously we're talking about California is kind of the hub of that. It started to expand out to your Texas, your Florida, your other big kind of truck show areas, but that kind of started to come a little bit later. Yeah. But, California, Southern California, you still had like some different kind of scenes popping up where the kids that came up in the lowrider craze, and maybe their dad had that Impala or Monte Carlo, they were getting into the mini trucks or even like the cars, the Nissan Sentras and stuff like that, but they were adapting a lot of the lowrider and Volkswagen influence onto those, where you had some reverse wire wheels. Yes. You had obviously the chrome, fender trim kind of crossed over on a lot of different things, but you'd see a candy paint job versus neon
or
granite,
pastel, or a
grid graphic, 80s MTV style. Yeah. You'd see a little bit more of that, or the tuck and roll, or not the tuck and roll, but like the tuft, velvet interiors versus tweed.
Button tuck, or velvet seats all day long. Yeah. And you mentioned that too. First off, let's say this. Let's not get us twisted. Without the lowrider influence in mini trucks, there wouldn't be air suspension. There wouldn't be that kind of. They showed everyone else, hey, look, I can lift and lower my truck with hydraulics. Yeah. And also too, one thing that they also introduced that completely took America by storm, dancing beds. Yeah. Yeah. You started kind of with the tilt bed, or what's funny is Hot Rod Magazine, who they were covering what was going on, but they weren't immersed in it. They were still hot rod and stuff. But, they did an article talking about, I'll just read off the article from, this is 1988, so a little bit later on in it, and shows all of it. But mini trucks are happening. They're fun, visual, audible, animated, and cozy. They're easy to work on and modify, and they have a personality. And qualities that few new vehicles priced under $10,000 can compete with. So we're talking $10,000 at that time. Yeah. We're talking early 80s was a $5,000, mid 80s maybe $6,000 truck. Right. Still very. And what was really cool, and they saw this too, was that it had limitless possibilities. Sure. You could have a mini racer. You could have an open air roadster, like you're saying. You're cutting the top off of it. Dump trucks is what they called it. But that started with the tilt bed. Right. That then expanded to the scissor lift, dancing bed. Right. All that kind of stuff. Lowriders, Euro stylers, high profilers, mini monster trucks, and so on. And what was really cool is that they saw this as maybe not the next generation of hot rodding, but it could be interpreted that way, where they were comparing it to what kids in the 40s and 50s were doing with a cheap, 32, coupe or roadster. Right. Is they were modifying it, and they were, but it was kind of a little bit of the opposite of some of that, where they were stripping it down for speed. Well, we're throwing a bunch of stuff on it. It ain't going fast. No. This is, you got a couple 100 pounds of audio in the bed, and, hydraulic pumps and batteries. It's not going fast. It's still a 2-liter 4-cylinder.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So that was kind of bringing in, we talked about the Euro influence, the lowrider influence, those guys kind of were coming up as their own kind of separate entity from what some of the, mini truck guys were doing in Orange County or out in West LA and stuff like that. And they would kind of have their own spots to cruise at. Yeah. Obviously true. Whittier Boulevard's a famous thing, but they'd go up cruise Hollywood. A lot of guys would kind of mix, there a little bit. But there's also, something that kind of was organized to try to keep not only, kind of clubs interacting, but, scheduling shows, because there was no internet back then. Right. So, you've got one club that wants to put on a show at their high school on, March 3rd. Right. Well, there's some other guy that's trying to put a show on, as an open house or whatever on March 3rd. Right. So the Southern California Mini Truck Council, that kind of came about to, and mostly what it was, hey, come up and promote your show, and like make sure it's not on the same weekend as that guy's, so that way people can go to both. Right. And the council actually is a they were a product out of the 70s.
because they knew early on that that was an issue. Because also with van and truck runs, they also had what they called rallies.
Yeah.
Right.
Poker rally, poker run.
Yeah. And very similar to like a poker run or like a scavenger hunt. They would like give you clues. You'd have to drive to different places. And they would, also too, they'd play like a rally type of situation, like where you would have a navigator and they would check your mileage at every single stop. And you were even awarded for, best navigation, the guy that got to the location with the least amount of
miles,
distance, or least amount of time. So it was very motorsports generated back then. Whereas the 80s, hey, we're more about show cars.
Yeah.
Right. And rightfully so, though, because after a time, rallies got dangerous because a rally would usually end up at a pizza place. Or some type of like food location, like where you would actually congregate. Well, what happens at a pizza place in the 70s?
You're drinking beer.
You're drinking beer, right? Yeah. So it was kind of a bad situation, and that's why truck runs seemed to be kind of a better idea because you got everybody at one place for a couple days and you partied, and when it was done, it was done.
Yeah. Well, and I look, obviously I started going to places like Rezo, for truck run. Actually, my first truck run was the Southern California Mini Truck Council run.
Oh, okay.
And I did that on purpose. And we're definitely going to get into the details of truck runs later because there's a lot of little things that people may not, be familiar with. But obviously back even in the early 2000s, there was a thing called, virgin runners.
Yeah.
And you basically would be hazed and initiated kind of if it was your first truck run.
Right.
So, I had joined Local Finesse, and the Rezo was the big truck run at the time, and that we went to, and that was over New Year's.
Right.
That was Bob Hayes ran it, but that was first started by Westside Mini Truckers in the 1975.
75.
Yeah, 75 was the first one of that, and there's some truck runs before that, but
well, technically it was like they planned it in 75 because the first one was 76.
Okay.
Yeah, but and Bob was part of West Side Truckers back then, and
then he took it over when they started, and then Sunset, ran it.
And we'll get into that. That's another episode. We'll get into
that's a history of its own. But so that was coming up. There was only me and a couple other guys that there was the Mini Truck Council run in like October or November maybe, so a couple months before that.
Right.
Well, not for some reason people weren't going to that, but a couple of us, the young guys were going. We were like, let's go to that ourselves. And basically then by the time Rezo comes around, we've already gone to a truck run. Right. So, hey, you can't throw mustard or beer on or pour beer on us and all that stuff because we've already been to a truck run.
Yeah.
So we went to that, and that was a good time. But that was basically what I looked at for a truck run was lock the gates at a campground,
right,
and just let the animals
and they would
do their thing.
They would,
and that way you're not risking. People would drive around and cruise around the showgrounds. You had hot tubs, kind of built into the back of trucks, and girls hanging out, and well, you're not going to do that on the street because everyone's drinking and all that stuff. You're either going to crash and kill somebody or get pulled over. So just let them do whatever they want, and everybody's relatively safe. You're not messing with any outside authorities or people, and that's kind of what that was.
It was a good vibe, I mean, there was few fights.
There always was some fights, but
nothing that was usually too crazy. And for the most part, it was about that just party atmosphere. It was just we're here and we're gonna have a great time and have a great time with our trucks.
And that's and that kind of started to become mainstream too a little bit with the mini trucks. You look at the kind of mid to late 80s, and you had music videos on MTV where they were showing off, a tilt bed that had, 6 15s in the back. I mean, there was, Latigra and Bunny.
They like the cars that go boom.
Like the cars that go boom. I mean, all of that was very integrated into the culture of the late 80s, you know. But the Mini Truck Council, that was a place where then some of the lowrider guys started to blend, and meet, and interact with the guys from Orange County or other parts of LA. So you started to kind of, have a blending of some of the styles, and, you started to get, guys that were looking at, okay, yeah, the hydraulics that the LA guys are doing, well, okay, I can maybe adapt that onto something that was more Euro style.
Yeah.
Like one of the early trucks with that was like, Dan Marchese's, hard body that was in a BF Goodrich ad, pretty famous ad, but Sean Mahaney, he's put hydraulics onto the back of that. And that, it basically became guys trying to get just lower and lower. Well, everyone was beating their backs up with lowering blocks and shocks that weren't meant for as low as you were, and the torsion bars that had no more torsion in them. And you were just getting beat up, and you didn't care, but then you kind of started to get over it,
Yeah. I mean, old. Because there was times where torsion keys would fall out on the freeway and your car would hit the ground, It wasn't, because you got to remember that we talk about cranking the torsion bars, but we're actually uncranking the torsion bars. You're taking the tension out of the bar.
So it no longer rides.
So it doesn't ride at all.
As
right?
As
it drives like a
forklift.
To. Yeah. And the block thing, I mean, think about it. Block, that's a Band-Aid, right?
Yeah.
So you're driving the thing. If that's your only car, and after a while your girlfriend kind of gets over bouncing around, you start to think about air shocks. You start to think about another way of doing this. Coilovers were way too expensive and way too much technology at the time.
Yeah,
that was just
some of the young guys may not even understood it or not even.
So there were guys that started to look for other alternatives. And that also too, I think that's something that we should talk about for our next episode, because really the late 80s is when we started to see that. But throughout the mid 80s, it was still about, I'm going to uncrank my torsion bars, put some blocks in it, and roll the thing down the road. And again, in the sense of cruising, because guys like myself, I'm of that generation where 80s cruising was a big deal. Well, we stayed kind of more on the west side of LA, right? So your Santa Monica's, PCH, that kind of stuff, you kind of would sit around there. Guys from, say, maybe Whittier, they would cruise, obviously Whittier Boulevard, but the one big place, the mecca of cruising for the time, the 70s had Whittier Boulevard. Well, the 80s had Hollywood Boulevard. And Hollywood Boulevard was the circus.
Yeah.
You had you had a Ferrari, you had a 64 Impala, you had a 32 Roadster, you had a mini truck, you had a Volkswagen, all in the same four-way intersection at one time. You might even have some canyon racer guys that are driving, Porsches and fixed up, muscle cars.
It was, Hollywood,
it was everything.
Hollywood Boulevard, especially in the 80s. Yeah, that was, Sunset. You had, all the bands that were, the Roxy and the whiskey, that was a scene for LA.
But also too, like the dance crazes, the Florentine Gardens, again too, these are the house party guys that were trying to bring that house party into, or that club atmosphere into house parties, vice versa. You had those kind of like, I remember the Palace, Florentine Gardens, what's the other one too? Madame Wong's, like all of those things were all like dance related. Even though I wasn't in the music, but I went there for the cars. I went to go see what those guys, what's new Minis out with, what are they up to? Just to, that was kind of an area where you could see those guys, because I wasn't going to drive my car from the LAX airport all the way out to Whittier. That to me just seemed like, driving from here to Arizona.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's what's crazy. Like at the time, that's like 20 miles away or something.
Right,
but, and that's the thing is like, you're talking about how could different styles of trucks, pop up and
you're so close, right?
Be 20 miles from each other, but that's kind of how it was back in the day is there wasn't, people weren't as easily connected on that. I know we're going to get kind of more into the heavy fabrication, the introduction of hydraulics, but also airbag suspension, body drops, kind of a changing of the guard on a lot of the mini truck stuff. But, one kind of aspect that we've kind of not touched on, as much is the monster minis.
Oh yeah.
The crazy lifted, minis. Cause, some of the early 70s, or the mid 70s and late 70s, looking at the mini truck magazines, not Mini Truckin' magazine, but they always had an off-road lifted, truck and a street style truck.
Right.
And that's kind of what a lot of that was. And obviously we've covered, a lot of the lifted Blazers and K10s and that kind of style from the 70s and 80s, but you had guys doing the same thing with, you know, a Toyota, you know, pickup or, you know, something like that, or, you know, where you were doing the same kind of stuff that people were doing on the full size with the bull bars and the light bars over the head, but that kind of became its own style a little bit too.
Well, one thing about the Japanese manufacturers, mostly Toyota and Nissan, they embraced off-road racing from the get-go.
Yeah.
I mean, that to them, that was their way of breaking into the mainstream, was to sponsor off-road racing. So you would have even models that were Baja editions. I mean, Nissan made a Desert Runner hard body that was supposed to be a Baja race truck. I mean, it's not anything near it, but they tried to style it after that. You know, Toyota forever sponsored Supercross. Nissan sponsored Mickey Thompson Off-Road Racing forever. So it made sense for that. Well, also, too, it made sense for Monster Minis, because now you got, again, a cheap mini truck that's four-wheel drive. And more than double the cost as your full-size Chevy four-wheel drive. But these guys, the mini trucks, what was nice about them was they were smaller. So some of the off-road guys that were into mud bogging and stuff like that, they wanted a smaller, nimble vehicle to get through that stuff.
And for desert racing or a little desert stuff too.
Yeah.
And,
yeah.
You know, you obviously had Jeeps and stuff like that, but like if you weren't into Jeeps, you know, mini truck was a little better. But of course, like anything, you know, people started going crazy with them, and like, how big of a tire can I put on?
Oh yeah.
How many shocks?
Oh yeah.
Can I put on?
Oh yeah.
Like, that's one thing that, you know, we mentioned, you know, there was a time when people would put a dozen shocks on one wheel. I'm saying on one wheel. I didn't finish. Yeah.
Yep.
So you're talking, you know, versus one shock, or, you know, that was good enough, or maybe, I mean, unless you were drilling out the, you know,
now let's talk about
seal
that
and stuff. Yeah.
Okay.
So I know you got some personal stories on that.
So what's funny about that? That was a thing. That was a big thing. If you were into the Monster Minis, which I was very heavily into the Monster Minis, you were actually judged on how many shocks you had. And there were times where you would hear people saying, I have 52 shocks on my car. That's right, 5.2. And the way you would do that is you would buy a brand new 4019, you know, a Rancho shock, and immediately drill the hole and drain all of the oil out of the shock and put it on your vehicle.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's just a dummy shock.
It's just a dummy shock.
Yeah.
But that was like the thing to show, hey, I've got, you know, 25 shocks, which they were about $30 a piece. So you start kind of adding it up. Like the guy that had 52 shocks, like, you know, he's got an investment.
He's got a couple $1,000s.
Which now you look at it, it's like a set of Kings.
Yeah.
But
and Kings actually function.
And Kings actually function, right?
Yeah.
But you know,
you're still getting the functionality of one shock out of that
right?
whole deal. Yeah.
But that was the trend, you know. And also too, more shocks meant more points. So again, if we're going to show trucks, you got to go that, hey, I've got more than he does.
And that's and obviously with a lifted mini truck, you can see the suspension, you can see the frame. So people were chrome plating and painting the undercarriages and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And that, you know, the style of that also kind of, you know, we some people called it Pismo style or like Hawaiian style and stuff like that. But you'd have, you know, tire sizes were fairly limited back then.
Sure.
But you'd see, you know, an insanely lifted jack truck with kind of some wider, you know, smaller tires.
But that was stability. You know, the mini truck guys, yes, they were small and their center of gravity was not good. So they would roll over easy.
Yeah.
This I know.
Yeah. You've done that with a Toyota.
Yes. But the thing too was when you're on a 40-inch tall tire, that's only a 1250 wide tire. Yeah. It's unstable when you're in a mini truck. Yeah. So if you have a 40-inch tire, that's an 1850 Mickey Thompson, 39 1850 15s.
You know that.
I know that. Yeah. All of a sudden now you've got a tire that's this giant piece of rubber that's going to help you stabilize the truck as you drive down the freeway. However, it also fights you because any groove on the freeway, that 18 wide tire is going to grab that groove and pull you. So you had to plan. I mean, you know, I know you steer a vehicle, but when you drove a big Monster Mini on the freeway, it was more like you piloted, or even I felt more like a boat captain, you know, because you would have to kind of drive and anticipate like, oh, I see this coming up. Oh my God. You know, so, and those drove just like the mini trucks with no torsion bars. I mean, there were booby bouncers. You'd sit there and just ride around. Okay,
now you're shaking on camera. No, and that's, you know, you also had, you know, one thing we kind of touched on a little bit was like the sticky outies is what, a lot of people called them.
Right.
Where they were the lowered trucks with the reverse wheels that stuck out,
right,
from it. And to me, I always thought that was kind of just a carryover from a lot of the lowriders, or maybe what was available at the time. But, you kind of brought up, it made sense where, there weren't really custom wheels until later on with the billet stuff and
right.
Boyd and all that. So you were limited on what offsets and backspaces you could use. Well, and if you wanted to get as low as you couldn't turn if you had the wheel tucked in, on that, or that just wasn't available. So they would stick out a little bit easier to navigate.
So you're after the stretch, just like how the late model European guys right now are after the stretch.
Yeah.
You'd want that 195 5015 BFG Euro radials too. You wouldn't put a TA radial on a mini truck. You had to put a Euro radial on it. So Euro radials, that tire on a 10-inch Inky or a Keystone or a Western wheel would stretch that thing out, so your Nissan hardbody would actually be able to get into a parking lot. You'd get that extra, and I mean, you were fighting for 3/4, 1 inch because you didn't have an adjustable suspension, right? I mean, you're a fixed static deal.
You're trying to get as low as you could, and you were fighting where and how you could drive it, and obviously people started to try to fix that with the air shocks and making it more adjustable, and but that didn't really come into its own until airbags started to pop up, and obviously the hydraulics, and some of the first fully laid out and body drop trucks actually had hydraulics in it, and that's before airbags. Obviously air suspension has been around for a long time, since the 40s, and used in like NASCAR racing and just more stability, load,
different transportation
capacity.
too.
Yeah, obviously, big rig semi trucks and all that, but you had guys that like Brian Gendro that were young mini truck guys figuring, okay, how can I get this as low as possible, but then still be able to raise it up and drive and get in and out of a driveway.
Yeah.
And that's kind of really what ushered in a whole different style, a whole different era of mini trucks, in the 90s and on. So that's kind of where we're going to leave, this one and jump into the next episode. That's going to be, kind of the birth of air, the birth of the body drop, the birth of the heavy fabric.
There you go.